So I'd like to thank everybody for attending, and I'd like to thank our 3 panelists and for the other organizations that help co-sponsor, the Animal Law Society, the Food Law Society, Effective Altruists, and is there anyone else I'm missing, Kate? Okay, so that's good. DOS Grant Fund, yeah, thank you for the DOS Grant Fund for helping fund this today. So I will I'll introduce each of the panelists and just say sort of their names and where they work, and I'll let them talk a little bit about their exact role and kind of what their path was to that role. So on the far right, we've got Cailen LaBarge, who's with Animal Equality. Next to her, we have Stephanie Harris with Humane Society of the United States. And next to her on my right here is Laura Hagen for People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And with that, I'll let them go to it. Thank you. And could you use your mics because we're recording? Sure.
All right. So thank you again for having me today on mic. As Chris said, I currently work with the PETA. I work with the PETA Foundation. I'm an attorney there, and I actually work on captive animal law enforcement issues. So, but prior to my work at the PETA Foundation, I was with the Massachusetts Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the MSPCA, which is based here in Massachusetts. And in that role, I was a deputy director of advocacy, and I worked in that role on a variety of issues impacting all kinds of animals, including animals that are raised for food. And so my comments today come from my experiences there and then my personal views about those experiences. I'm not really here on behalf of the PETA Foundation or reflecting the PETA Foundation's views on these ballot initiatives and state legislation. So that is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about state legislation and ballot questions in the US and using those as a mechanism to create positive change for animals that are used in agriculture. I'm going to look at them from a very broad, big picture level. I'm not going to dig into the process very much. I'm looking more and talking more about the pros and cons of each of these 2 mechanisms for change and kind of contrasting them against each other a little bit. So I'm going to dig right in because I'm a bit over time. So I'm going to start with the state legislation piece. And that's where I spent most of my time with the MSPCA. And generally speaking, state legislation in the US has been an incredibly powerful tool to make change for animals. Where we haven't been able to see movement, maybe at the federal level or at the state regulatory level, state legislatures have been very responsive to animal issues. And I think a lot of that is because, state legislators are very connected to their communities. They know people in their communities, and they're very responsive to feedback from those folks. And they're also very responsive to public pressure. So it's been a really great place to move the ball forward for animals in our country. Another really great aspect of state legislation is that it's a pretty limited audience. And so when you're making your argument and you're working your way through the legislative process, you're only talking to a small fraction of the legislature at one time. So a lot of states, you start with a committee, so you're talking to 10 to 15 people, and you're making your argument to them. And especially for controversial legislation, which legislation impacting animals raised for food often is, it's a really nice way to go about the process because you're making your argument, you can tailor your argument really easily to that audience, and then once you win at that level, then you go to the next level. Maybe you're talking to House leadership or Senate leadership, or maybe you're just talking to the House. But it's really nice because you can kind of focus in and then you can knock one piece of the process off at a time and just work your way through until eventually, hopefully, you make your way to the finish line. Another positive piece about state legislation is that if you don't cross that finish line initially, it's a pretty easy lift to come back again. Massachusetts, we have a 2-year legislative session. Most state legislatures get together at least every couple of years. And so if you can't quite make it through the process, what you can do is take the relationships that you've built, the information that you've learned, the political capital that you've built, and you take all of that, you learn from it, you maybe tweak some things, tweak some strategy, and then you come back the next session and you start again. Yeah, you've spent some money, yeah, you've spent some time, but it's pretty easy to just get the process rolling again. But even though you can get the process rolling again, one of the big downsides for state legislation is you often have to get the process rolling again many, many, many times. In the end, state legislation, because it does have so many different like I was saying earlier, where you can kind of go through each part of the process and pick it off, those are each places where your bill can stop or stall or fail. And so that makes it inherently very difficult. And a lot of the state legislative process is in many ways set up to be difficult. It's set up to make it hard to get something across the finish line. And to just give you some context for that, in Massachusetts, there are 6,000 to 8,000 bills filed in our state here every year, or every 2 years in our legislature. 3 to 5% of those bills ultimately make it over the finish line every 2 years. So we go from 6,000 to 8,000 being filed to a few hundred that actually are signed into law by the governor. And so we're talking a very, very small percentage where you actually see success. So you certainly have to have a high level of stick-with-itness to be successful at the state level, and that is definitely one of the downsides. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but that's what we saw with farm animal legislation here in Massachusetts. The other big downside, I would say, that is kind of built into the legislative process is compromise. I can't even imagine a bill being filed in the legislature and coming out the other end exactly as it was written. Again, all those little pieces and all those little steps along the way are opportunities for someone to flag something and say, hey, I don't like this, or I have an issue with this in my district. Do you think you could tweak this a little bit? And so at a certain point, as you're working through the legislative process, you compromise, and sometimes, and again, particularly as it relates to making change for animals that are raised for food, you have to say, is this worth continuing to move forward? Is this worth getting across the finish line? And that's kind of the story that we saw here in Massachusetts in working to create legislative change for farm animals. The MSPCA, the Humane Society, and other groups worked for more than 30 years to try to get a bill through the state legislature. Different varieties of bills coming at it from different angles, and never found success. And then finally, in the last year that a bill was filed, the second to last year that a bill was filed, you were able to get a bill out of its initial committee, but they had stripped from the language the most impactful language. It was a confinement bill that prohibited veal crates, gestation crates, and battery cages. But the only animals that were in Massachusetts that were kept in intensive confinement systems were battery cage hens. And that language was stripped from the bill when it came out of committee. And then when it came time to try to get the bill through the Senate, they wanted us to compromise even more. And so at a certain point, we just said, you know what? This isn't worth it. We're just going to put something in law that doesn't make a change for animals, so why are we doing that? And so as you're working your way through the legislative process, sometimes you say, is this the best path forward? And after 30 years, and you know, it was 12 years in a row of just coming back again and again and again to the legislature without success. And so after that time, you know, when you have groups that are working together in a coalition, you say, guys, is this the best path forward? Is this the best use of our time? And we are lucky in Massachusetts in that we're one of more than 50% of states in the US that have a ballot question. And so we have the opportunity to take the issue directly to the voters. So Stephanie is going to talk a bit more about the ballot question, and I'm not going to dig into the mechanics of it. But I am going to talk about some of the pros and cons with ballot questions, particularly as they're contrasted with state legislation. So I think one major asset of ballot questions is that substantively you can go much farther than you can when you're trying to convince a legislature what to do. As I said, compromise is just a huge part of the legislative process. And with ballot questions, it's just not built into the process at all. You may make some, you know, you write your language, you put it in front of the voters, and the voters vote on it. And so you may make some compromises at the outset, but you make those decisions at the beginning, and then once you file the language, you move forward with it. There are some little unique things that Stephanie will talk to you about, but for the most part, that's the way you do it. It's not built into the process, and that's actually really great because you can push farther than you would if you're trying to convince 200 legislators that this is a good idea. I think actually one of the major benefits of the ballot question process, besides maybe a greater ability to win, is the opportunities that it creates to educate people on the issues. You know, I mentioned earlier that one of the good things about the legislative process is you have a very small audience. That's certainly not the case with the ballot question process. It's the exact opposite, in fact. And to be successful at a ballot question initiative, you have to talk to literally hundreds of thousands of people in Massachusetts or elsewhere. Even in a small state like Massachusetts, you have to talk to hundreds of thousands of people just to get it on the ballot in the first place, and then even more to get people to say, yes, I think this is a good idea. And this is both a pro and a con for ballot questions because it takes a lot of infrastructure and a lot of work. But what it does is it creates opportunities for conversations, and especially as it relates to animals that are basically hidden in our industrial agricultural system, it creates these opportunities to talk to people about food and where our food comes from that just don't exist with the legislative process or many other processes. So I looked at the numbers. So we had a ballot question here in 2016 on farm animal confinement, and they had another one in California just last year. And just to get those two issues on the ballot, when I looked at the numbers, we had to have at least 1 million conversations just to get those two ballot questions on the ballot. That doesn't even count talking to voters after they got on the ballot. So Stephanie is going to talk to you about how questions get on the ballot, but you have to ask people for a signature. And to do that, most people won't just give it to you. You have to tell them what you're talking about. And it's the first time many people have heard about intensive confinement systems. So, and it's not even just those conversations. Once you get it on the ballot, you know, in most states, the average number of ballot questions is 4. There are some outliers, but in most states that have ballot questions, the average number on the ballot is 4. So what that means is it's a very concentrated number of issues, unlike the legislature where there are thousands. It's very concentrated, and so it draws a lot of media attention. And so you'll get major newspapers in the states taking positions on the ballot questions. The governor weighs in, major politicians weigh in. Am I taking your talk? Okay, major politicians weigh in. There are radio programming about it. There are ads that run on TV. You know, when I think about the ads that ran for question 3, you know, I just think about a family sitting in front of their TV watching like This Is Us or Law and Order or something, and then an ad comes on that's showing the realities of industrial animal agriculture. And maybe there's opportunities for conversation there. Maybe those people never thought before about what they were putting on their plate and where it came from. And so I think that, you know, while ballot questions are an unbelievable amount of work, it's the unique requirement of the ballot questions that you have conversations about the issues and that you get out and you let people know about the depths of these issues. That really is an ancillary benefit to this really exhaustive, very expensive process. And briefly, I did want to hit on some of the downsides, of which cost is one of those. Ballot questions are not cheap, and statistically, the lower spender generally does not win at the ballot. So you have to be prepared if you want to be a part of a ballot question to spend and spend heavily. The ballot question in Massachusetts cost about $3.6 million. The one in California rang up at around $18 million. So you have to have the infrastructure to do fundraising. You have to have the money, and you know it's a lot. It's not a small amount of money. And so I think that's one of the issues, the cost that particularly within the animal movement has, and particularly with Prop 12 in California, became a question, which was, if we're going to be spending this much money and this much volunteer energy and investing this much political capital and elevating the conversation in this way about animals that are raised for food, is this how we want to be doing it? You know, do we want to, are these too incremental? You know, do we want to be doing more if we're spending this much money? And, you know, I think personally, and I should share that the PETA, that is PETA's view. That was PETA's view on Prop 12. I think, and this is my personal opinion, but you know, I think that there are two sides to the coin. Like, I think that ballot questions, unlike legislation, do give you that opportunity to do more and to stretch a bit further. But the reality is that when you're in the midst of these campaigns, you know, they feel neck and neck every single day. No matter how strong your polling is, you always feel like you're going to be one vote short of making it over that finish line. And so that has to be a consideration when you're writing this language. You can be bolder, but you can only be so bold, because whether it's the legislature, whether it's the voters, you know, they love reasonableness. They want to feel like they're doing something reasonable. And so you have to make sure that you're working off of that benchmark and that you're working off of what what your polling tells you is going to be successful. So I think that's a very, a big factor in when you look at what you're putting forward in these ballot questions. And I think the process is whether legislation or ballot questions are inherently incremental, and I think they have to be, because you're asking other people to take this step on issues they may have never ever thought about before, which is often the case with animal agriculture. And I think the thing with ballot questions too is that, if I mentioned earlier with legislation that if you don't make it, you can kind of pick up and come back next year. It's pretty easy to do that. With ballot questions, and you'll understand this much more after Stephanie talks, but the structure and the infrastructure and the money that's required to make these successful, it's not easy to pick it back up and come back again. And it's also a very, very public loss for animals if you lose at the ballot. Like I said, every media outlet is talking about these things. So if you lose, it's an extremely public loss. If you lose, a piece of legislation, it can be public, but you're one of thousands of bills that didn't get across the finish line, and it's so common, it's what everybody expects. And so you want to make sure that you're putting something forward that's going to be successful so that we can have a win for animals, and we can say, yes, people do care about animals that we don't see that are in industrial animal agriculture. So, I think that they're really, and for farm animals anyway, it's about half and half at this point. I think there's five, it's kind of a mix, but there's around 5-6 state bills that have passed on farm animal agriculture and confinement, 4 ballot questions, and 2 that have passed via regulation. So broadly, there's not too many, but we've really needed, especially for farm animals, to be able to go to the ballot to make a difference for these animals. So I think it's just a really incredible, impactful tool.
Okay, hey everybody. My name is Stephanie Harris. I'm the Massachusetts and Rhode Island State Director for the Humane Society of the United States. I got into this work after working for a little while in wildlife rescue and rehabilitation, and then I worked in wildlife policy, and then in farm animal public policy, specifically out of HSUS's headquarters in outside of DC. And then I started working on ballot campaigns. So I worked up in Michigan on a campaign and up in Maine on a campaign for bears, and then came down to Massachusetts to take on the state director role. And I knew going into that role that there was likely to be this 2016 farm animal campaign. And so I have, as they say, caught the ballot bug. I really enjoy working on ballot campaigns for a lot of the reasons that Laura outlined. And so Laura teed things up really well. I'm going to delve a little deeper into the ballot initiative process in Massachusetts specifically, and a little more specifics about the 2016 campaign. And then some of our next steps for Massachusetts. So one of the things that, or some of the factors that we consider before deciding to take an issue to the ballot, and like Laura said, it's usually a coalition effort, and certainly if you want to have a successful ballot campaign, that's the approach that I would recommend taking, is really engaging as many diverse voices as possible and as early as possible. But it's helpful to have that coalition in place from the work that's being done on legislation. So I get folks that come up to me all the time with ideas for ballot campaigns that could be pursued in Massachusetts. And it's not that I don't think that those efforts are worthwhile. Of course, they probably are if they're looking to help protect animals. But if there isn't a history on the issue in the state already, then you're setting yourself up for a much more difficult fight and a lot more potential opposition. Because one of the things that the legislature, that working through the legislature allows you to do, is to find out what the opposition is going to be, like Laura said. So you really get a sense of who the players are, what opposition is going to come out, what could work and what wouldn't work. But then one of the cons, and Laura alluded to this a little bit, is that once you've taken something to the ballot, that process is inherently a workaround to the state legislature. So legislators typically wouldn't look kindly on an issue if it was taken straight to the ballot, if you didn't even give them a chance to pass it, to work on it, to find a solution that would work for everyone. So that's something that I always keep in mind, and that I like to remind folks that, that like me get really excited about ballot campaigns, is that it's helpful to start in the legislature rather than just take something straight to the ballot. And then of course the other factors are what states allow the ballot initiative process. There's only about half of the states that do, and some of them the process is so burdensome that it's actually pretty prohibitive. And there are efforts ongoing all across the country in the states that have the ballot initiative process to make it even more difficult, additional requirements and hurdles to put in place for gathering signatures and things like that. So that's something that we try to keep an eye on, and some of my colleagues have been involved in fighting against those efforts. So which states allow the ballot process, and which have a realistic base to grow from? So that's part of the coalition, and what's the history in that state, and you know, do you have a volunteer pool to work with? Because this is a really expensive and labor-intensive process. And then how impactful will that state be on a larger scale? Like what impact would this have across the nation? Is it just going to impact your state, or will there be broader ramifications? Are you going to lead the country in some way? And funding, of course, like Laura talked about, these ballot campaigns are expensive and frankly getting more expensive. And a large reason for that is that they have to compete with airtime with major political campaigns. So because these are on the ballot on election day along with candidates, depending on the cycle you choose, the media buys can be astronomically expensive. And you know, how vital a state is that during, say, a presidential race? You know, those ad buys are just going to skyrocket. So those are some of the things to consider really off the bat. And then in Massachusetts, we, like Laura talked about, we were considering how far to go, what would work in this state, but we had this really long history of working on this issue in particular in Massachusetts, but also of working on ballot initiatives in Massachusetts, and specifically animal ballot initiatives. So there was a volunteer pool that had familiarity with the ballot initiative process in Massachusetts specifically. There was a 1988 ballot campaign, unsuccessful, but that was seeking to establish some protections for farm animals. In 1996, there was a wildlife protection ballot initiative that prohibited the use of body gripping traps, and that was successful. So there was an enormous volunteer push behind that. And then throughout the 2000s, there were 3 different campaigns seeking to end the use of greyhound racing in Massachusetts. And that final time it was successful. And so that was the most recent campaign prior for animals prior to the 2016 campaign, but it was recent enough that there were these volunteers that were familiar with the process. We had some that had worked on the 1988 campaign that came out in leading up to the 2016 campaign, and that is an amazing history, and some people that worked on every single one of these animal initiatives. But so just to give you a sense of the initiative petition process in Massachusetts, and it's different in every state that has it, and there's quirks to every single one that make it more, make them uniquely difficult, we'll say. But I'll just give a quick overview. So the first step is to file initiative petition language with the Attorney General's office for review to make sure that it meets certain criteria, that it doesn't violate our Constitution, for example, and that it's just basically workable as a law. And then after that, you need to file with the Secretary of the Commonwealth, and you need 10 initial signers. So those signers are the initial backers of the campaign. So they need to be people that are really dedicated to that issue and to it remaining intact throughout the process. Because there is one opportunity for sort of compromise in the ballot initiative process in Massachusetts, and so you want to make sure that everybody is in agreement about how you move forward on that campaign. And then it's the piece of it that everybody is most familiar with. It's your really big signature drive. And so in Massachusetts, you have to gather signatures that represent 3% of the votes in the last gubernatorial election. So for us, that was about 70,000 signatures, which is a lot for Massachusetts. It's for a state this size. Of course, the signature drives are typically proportional to a state's population, or at least its voter base. So in a state like California, it's a much higher number, but they also have a lot more people to be pulling from to volunteer for. So that's your first major hurdle, is the signature drive. And you can't collect more than a quarter of your signatures from any one county. So So even though the greater Boston area is, of course, the most densely populated, which makes it, therefore, easier to gather signatures here because there are just more crowds of people, you have to be really careful to build out an infrastructure, a volunteer and staff infrastructure that can collect these signatures all across the state. Those signatures, once collected, they have to go through a couple of review processes. They have to get submitted to the town and city registrar. So we have 351 towns and cities in Massachusetts, and there have to be at least 351 separate petitions because those petition sheets have to be submitted to that town or city. In some states, in the initiative petition process, even when they have that kind of oversight at the local level, you can send the same petition sheet to multiple towns and get it certified. But in Massachusetts, we had to be really careful that we only had one town or city per petition sheet. So that's a big hurdle, and that's a lot of mailing. So when you think about the cost of this, you might be thinking of printing, but are you thinking of postage? And what about the volunteer and staff infrastructure to process these petitions twice? Because they have to all go out to volunteers to gather the signatures on, and they have to all come back in, and then they have to all go out to the towns and cities, and they have to all come back in and get organized by county this time, and then submitted to the Secretary of the Commonwealth. So it's a lot of work, and there's also strict compliance in terms of stray marks on petitions. So you have to be really careful that signatures are inside the narrow little lines, that your printed name, your signature, really tiny area to include that. And in some cases, if those rules aren't strictly followed, that individual signature or that entire petition sheet could get thrown out. So that could be 20 signatures that you just lose off the bat. So once they're back from the towns and cities, they go to the Secretary of the Commonwealth, like I said, and then you wait and you hope that all of your signatures have been certified. And assuming that they are, the initiative gets transmitted to the general court, and so that's the state legislature. And the legislature has a period of time where they can choose to pass your petition into law. They can propose an alternative, or they can reject yours or do nothing. And if that's the case, and that is most often the case, then you proceed with the rest of the process in Massachusetts. And so in Massachusetts, that involves a second signature drive. And so that's, this time it's a smaller round. It's 0.5% of the last gubernatorial election. But there's another signature period, and you go through the same process, out to the towns, back from the towns, to the Secretary of the Commonwealth, and then you wait and you hope that you are certified once more. And assuming that you are qualified for the ballot, and so then you await your question number, because until then you're just working with the initiative petition title and not an actual question number. So all your messaging and all your collateral shifts, because finally you can start saying yes on 3 for that particular election cycle, 3 in our case. So that's just a quick overview of the process. But for us specifically, and for anyone who's interested in the sort of strategy on these ballot campaigns, there are other things to consider besides just that structure, just that clear timeline of when things are due where, because there's a lot of things that need to be happening to get you ready for Election Day, because that's your focus all along. I mean, you have to get the signatures, but you have to keep this longer, greater goal in sight. And you have to think about things like volunteer burnout. And that's certainly a reality. I mean, when you've pushed everybody day in and day out for several weeks to get signatures, and then they get a little bit of rest, and then we're like, okay, we got to do it again for that second round. That's something to contend with. And then not wanting to lose time because of downtime, and making sure you're using that strategically and asking volunteers to take actions that will help you outside of that signature gathering role. And of course, that's useful too, because not everybody likes gathering signatures. Not that many people like gathering signatures. Let's just be honest about it. It's a lot of no thank you, hands in the face. I'm sure many of you have gotten that as well. All set, exactly. Very familiar phrase. I tell you, I will sign virtually any petition that comes before me, because I have been rejected enough times in my life that I don't need to perpetuate that. So virtually anyone, I will sign it. If you want to find me after this, feel free. But some of the things that I was thinking of, and that anybody who's engaged in the ballot initiative process has to think through during that timeline that I laid out is, okay, we're working around the legislature. So at what point do we give them a heads up that this is coming? When do we let the legislators know? What about the people that the legislators that sponsored your bill, that were working on it for years, sometimes decades. You want to give them the heads up. What about the coalition? How quickly do you grow it? You want to keep things discreet from the opposition, but you want to make sure to be inclusive. Donors, you need to start reaching out to them early. You need to be creating collateral. When exactly do you want to go public? At a certain point, it becomes public, whether you want it to be or not, but when is that? When do you want to let folks know in advance? You need to be growing a staff and volunteer team. You need to be organizing an office, and like I said, with the petitions going in and out and in and out, and that's just the formal process, but also what about the volunteers that are all constantly ready for another volunteer packet? How do you make sure that you've got a process that's going to get them what they need as quickly as possible? Because unlike with the legislative process, this is a tight timeline, and there is one chance. Because like Laura said, it's millions of dollars that are invested, and this is really one shot. You're not likely to be able to go back to the ballot right after. So you need to be really careful about using all your resources and developing messaging for volunteers, for supporters, for the general public. All of those messages are a little bit different. They can get more complicated depending on somebody's level of involvement. But you want to make sure you can keep it interesting from when you launch the campaign until Election Day. And that's a good spread of time. So you want to dole messages out accordingly. And what about a media plan? Is getting media attention early going to help your campaign? Or are you really just giving your opposition a platform before you want to? So do you want to seek out lots of press attention? Do you want to do a press release? Or do you want to just kind of keep things discreet and focus on your volunteers and your signature drive? And then what about your media buy? How big a media buy do you want to place? You have to place those really early. Do you want to pay for signatures? Or are you going to try to do them all volunteer? In Massachusetts, in the 2016 campaign, we were the only ballot initiative that qualified all volunteer, so we didn't pay a firm to gather signatures. We had staff that worked for our campaign or that worked for our coalition partners that helped collect signatures, but we didn't pay a signature gathering firm, and that is certainly the direction that a lot of states with the ballot initiative process are heading, where they're relying more and more on these paid signature gathering firms. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's signature gathering is really a difficult thing to do, and it's hard to find enough volunteers with enough hours in the day to do this. I mean, people would, and some of you in the room, I mean, you dedicated your every waking free moment to this campaign, and of course I will be eternally grateful for that, and so will the hens and the breeding pigs and the calves raised for veal. And then also, besides your signature gathering, what about collecting endorsements? And what about making sure you have surrogate speakers? And even if you don't want to seek that press attention early, you want to be sure you're ready right before Election Day, because things really start to ramp up then, and you want to be able to be there for every interview, every debate, at least everyone you think is strategic. And I can't be in 351 towns and cities at once, so it's important to have lots of other people that are willing to speak on behalf of this issue and that care about it and that represent various perspectives. So certainly Laura was one of the people that was out there traveling around the state, helping especially in the days leading up to the election. So, okay, I think I'm running short on time, so I'm going to be kind of quick. Okay, the same day that we filed that second set of signatures, there was a lawsuit that was filed to challenge whether our ballot initiative could go to the ballot or should go to the ballot because of single subject, and thankfully that was not successful, and so we were able to. But there's a requirement in Massachusetts that a ballot initiative be single subject, and so for us, this is one single subject. It's about the way the animals are raised and the sales, but it's all about preventing the cruel treatment of farm animals, so it's a single subject. And then also, since the initiative passed, which it did, by the way, overwhelmingly 78%, and so thank you to all of you that helped get us there and voted on Election Day in 2016. Since then, in just January of this year, the U.S. Supreme Court decided that 13 states could not sue Massachusetts over that law, so that was a great victory for farm animals. And Massachusetts' success was absolutely directly related to California's decision to pursue what became Prop 12 at the ballot in the 2018 cycle. And so if we hadn't won, and if we hadn't won so overwhelmingly, 78% is huge. I don't know how much that resonates with folks, but that is an astronomical percentage to win. So that's really a testament to how much people in Massachusetts care, and not just people, not just animal people that are in the room, not just farm animal people, but everyday people really care about this issue. That's 8 out of 10 people in Massachusetts that don't want to see farm animals suffer. That's massive, and that makes a really big statement, and one that has an effect all across the country. And so that helped directly lead to California.
Can I add a factoid?
Please.
It was the biggest victory in Massachusetts' 100-plus year ballot question history. It was the biggest margin of victory in our entire history of ballot questions. So it's really incredible.
Yeah. Thanks, same to you. Thanks to all of you. Thank you. And some of you might have seen that McDonald's has announced that it's 30% of the way cage-free, and that is in part thanks to the momentum of this ballot initiative. Certainly we saw a lot of companies tip the scale on their decision to go cage-free during our signature drive because they knew this was coming and they knew the impact it would have. So what's next? What's next for Massachusetts? What's next for the rest of the country on these issues? And Massachusetts has led the way. California followed really soon thereafter. There are other states that are exploring this now. I think we can expect to see some changes in state legislatures because it's become so clear that this is something that constituents want. But there may be some places that really it has to go to the ballot to get over the finish line. And so we'll have to wait and see exactly what that will look like. There are lots of factors to consider that I mentioned before making that decision. And then in Massachusetts specifically, for farm animals, there is, of course, still room for improvement. And so Laura was so involved in this when she was working for the MSPCA, and HSUS is involved in this with MSPCA still, is working to pass the citations bill. So that's legislation that would allow law enforcement officers to issue citations for cruel conditions for domestic animals. So that includes farm animals. So it's extending a law that currently exists for dogs and making sure that there is some middle ground so that law enforcement officers don't have to choose between a verbal warning and felony cruelty charges. Let's get some middle ground in there. So this is a written fine, a written citation. So that's what we're working on now. If you want to talk to your legislators about it, it's Senate Bill 989 and House Bill 1822, and it needs all the help it can get through this legislative process. Thank you.
Hey everybody, my name is Cailen LaBarge. I'm the General Counsel of Animal Equality. Prior to working at Animal Equality, I was at MFA for a couple years as a staff attorney. And I'm going to kind of go in a different direction and talk a little bit about international farmed animal legislation and operating, strategizing legislation for farmed animals on a broad scale, but also how that affects your strategy on a local and state level. And I'm going to start with some exciting news. We were just able to work with a senator in the Jalisco, Mexican state of Jalisco to pass a really historic bill that criminalizes cruelty to farmed animals, including failure to pre-slaughter stun the animals. It amends the Articles 305 through 308 of the Penal Code, and it's the first time that farmed animals are protected on a criminal level in Mexico at all. And the state of Jalisco is actually the biggest animal ag producer in the entire country of Mexico. And like I said, prior to this, farmed animals had no criminal cruelty protections in Mexico. And it actually comes with a statutory penalty of up to 4 years in prison if you fail to abide by the pre-slaughter stunning, and also if you don't engage in what they're called the official Mexican standards for animal handling at slaughter. And it really requires the state to prosecute, whereas before the cruelty to farm animals in the municipal slaughterhouses, as opposed to the federal slaughterhouses, was overseen by the state agricultural agency, and which really didn't have the capacity to monitor compliance, and so really wasn't doing anything about failure to comply with the state standards. And one of the things that was interesting to me about this process was we had originally introduced a bill at the federal level in Mexico, which essentially required the same thing, and took the compliance monitoring from SAGARPA, which is essentially Mexico's USDA, and put it in the hands of the state prosecutors and the DA's offices. That the language was changed in committee pretty significantly. We then went through an election process where the administration changed and the political party that was in power changed, and it kind of stalled out. And so we went with this state legislation strategy, and we're very successful, and now have a great relationship. As Laura said, relationships with legislators are very important. We now have a really great relationship with a lot of the legislators. It passed, not unanimously. There was, I think, about 14% that didn't vote at all, but every state legislator that voted for this bill voted in favor. And so now we have wonderful relationships with the Congress in Jalisco, and we're discussing bringing similar legislation to other states in Mexico. So I think it's a really great example of how, and it will have, like I said, implications because it's the biggest ag producer in the entire country, will have implications at the federal level. And also will allow us to introduce other bills in Jalisco itself that will help farmed animals even more. So animal quality is kind of unique in that it grew as more of a grassroots organization that ultimately incorporated a number of different countries and now is in 8 different countries. So we have to strategize working on international legislation in a way that is holistic, and a lot of that means pursuing legislation at the state and even local level, which I'll talk about in a second. We're working on ban the import of foie gras in the UK right now, which is being affected by the Brexit vote. So that's been somewhat interesting as well. The future of this bill depends on the future of Brexit, of course. So it's been interesting to work on that with our UK director and see how political matters that are outside of our control really affect the progress of these really important bills. We're also working on End the Cage Age, which would ban cages for all farmed animals in EU, which is an initiative started by Compassion in World Farming. And I'm just going to go really quickly over something interesting that happened in Brazil last year that kind of ties together working on the federal level versus the state and local level. We worked with two other groups on a petition to ban live export in the port of Santos port, which is outside of Sao Paulo. We initially brought the petition to a local judge. It was denied. We appealed and were successful on appeal, and the judge instituted an injunction on live export out of the entire port of Santos, which was huge. The decision was ultimately suspended by a federal judge in the state of Brasilia, but it really showed us the potential of working locally. And I think when you're trying to strategize about how to make progress for farmed animals, if you're working on a really progressive type of legislation, like banning live export, you have to be creative. And we felt like it was a really, had much more potential, it was much more viable to go at it at the local level. And ultimately unsuccessful, but we were able to suspend live export for a number of days. Now, then we had to deal with, okay, what do we do with these animals that are on the boat, which was its own issue, but it's really changed our strategy. These types of things that come up have changed our strategy from, okay, how can we pass these bills on a federal level or an international level that protect farm animals to that may not be withheld or may not actually be successful, to how can we make incremental change and that will actually have a federal result. I mean, the Prop 12 and Question 3, the sales bans will have federal implications. So it's really important to I think, be a little bit more creative for us at least when we're approaching this stuff. And another example of that is the New York City bill to ban foie gras. We're part of that coalition working to ban the sale of foie gras in New York City, and considering now using that tactic in other local and municipal cities across the US to try and get these types of sales bans passed, because I think they're just a little bit more viable than trying to go at the state or federal level. We have time for questions, so we only have 7 minutes left.
So give me a quick join me in thanking our panelists for talking today. It's great to see folks are so dedicated. they each have a bunch of other things they could have done with their time and their degrees for a lot more compensation, and it's just inspirational to see that they've devoted their lives to these issues that they care about a lot, and that many of us care about it as well. So does anyone have any quick questions? We've got a very short amount of time for questions. We'll probably go to about 5 after. Yeah. Sorry, can you please wait for the microphone, because I've...
Thank you very much. What were the other eight?
Sorry. Okay. He had his hand up first, but sorry, go ahead. You can go ahead.
What were the other 8 countries that you had mentioned? 8 countries, and I was wondering what the
we're
8 countries. And
US,
also, I had a
Mexico.
second question about if you expect the Brazil legislation to be rolled back with Bolsonaro. Thank you.
So Bolsonaro, yes, presents a lot of challenges of working in Brazil, not just on the legislative level, but also on the political and social level. We're finding that it's not as safe to perform and conduct some of the activities that we normally would do there, such as direct action or certain actions with our corporate campaigns. To answer your first question, we're in the US, Mexico, Brazil, the UK, Italy, Spain, Germany, and India. So the challenge with Bolsonaro is somewhat unique, but not unique in the sense that we're now seeing these types of governments pop up in other places. Specifically with the live export case, we are strategizing on bringing another state-level petition to ban live export. But before we do that, we're in discussions to perhaps, to conduct maybe not an investigation, but like focus a campaign on the live export industry itself. One of the something that's a little bit interesting about that issue is the Brazilian national meat industry is an unconventional ally in that fight because their competitor is the live export industry. So we're actually looking to have some discussions with the Brazilian national meat industry about their thoughts for attacking live export and trying to maybe approach it that way. So we're still discussing it. We're not sure exactly how we want to approach the petition next, but yeah, we want to involve as many groups as we can in that process.
I thought Lara said that...
Speak into the mic, please.
It cost more in Massachusetts, like a ballot question costing 26 million versus 18 million in California, or 80 million.
3.6 in Massachusetts. I'm sorry. It was 3.6 in Massachusetts. Yeah, versus 18. So it was a fraction. Yeah.
Is that just spent from the proponents of the ballot initiative? Do you know what the overall spending was on some of those?
Well, the 3.6 was across the coalition, if that's what you mean.
No, I mean the opposition as well.
Oh, the opposition. It was about 300,000. So they did not spend a lot of money in Massachusetts, and that was a lot due to the work that had been done around the country in terms of state legislative and ballot initiatives that had already taken place, but also the corporate campaigning that had been done, and so it sort of worked on across all of these angles, and that's the Massachusetts overwhelming success was a large reason that the opposition didn't spend more in California as well.
I think they spent less than $1 million.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact figure. That sounds about right. Yeah.
Got a question about.
Hey, what role does legislation that protects a few animals, like bears in Maine, say, play in legislation that protects lots of animals, such as farmed animals?
Are you asking just kind of like on balance, or?
On balance, or any interconnectedness for, like, say if it changes like public consciousness that then could affect the legislature, or it could helps to get a bill passed, so that then the legislator better understands how to pass such bills, or even from state to state.
Yeah, I think there is a positive correlation from state. I think any move that we make forward for animals at the state or local level, and we were kind of talking about this earlier, and this relates to what Cailen was talking about, and it translates to the US, where if we can't get something done at the state level, work at the local level, because we can get more done at the local level. And then the state legislators see that there are many districts in the state that have said, oh yeah, I think this is a good idea. So then they'll be more likely to consider it at the state level. And so I think the more that we normalize and elevate legislation or ballot questions that are relating to animal protection, and we make the very sound arguments that these are things that legislatures should be considering, and they're really important reasons why they should be considering it, then it becomes much more common. It's not this outlier issue. And I think that's I think I could confidently say, at least in state legislatures, I think we're kind of there at this point in most states, where it's pretty common to have a number of pieces of animal protection legislation filed, and it's pretty normal. And I think we're so lucky because we have such a dedicated and vocal group of advocates and people who really deeply believe and understand why these things are important and why making this change is important, and you really need that to move any of these pieces forward. Did that answer your question? Okay.
And if I could just add on the kind of spillover effect, I used to get some flack for working on cat and dog issues, but I know that prior to Massachusetts, the biggest farm animal protection ballot initiative was in California in 2008, Prop 2, and HSUS did all these really intense exit polling, and they found the single biggest determinant whether someone would vote yes on question 2 was pet ownership, if they were pet owners. So it shows like sort of compassion for companion animals does spill over into the farm animal realm.
And I think you build on it too. Like Stephanie was talking about the farm animal citation bill. So 6 or 7 or 8 years ago, the MSPCA was engaged in an effort to update our animal control laws in Massachusetts. And as a part of that, kind of at the last minute, an animal-friendly legislator on her own put a provision into the bill that said it's illegal to keep a dog, in cruel confinement conditions. And so that had been around. We had worked on, increasing enforcement of that and education. And then it was like, well, we saw some cases, particularly here in Massachusetts, where there were farm animals kept in cruel confinement conditions. And we said, well, why not farm animals? Why don't we take this law and talk to legislators about what we're seeing, the conditions we're seeing farm animals be kept on here in our state that are on their face cruel, and see if we can strengthen that law for farm animals. And so that's what this bill does. It builds on that past success for dogs and cats.
And one of the things that sets Massachusetts apart, it's not entirely unique in this, but that really makes a difference, is that we have animal control officers in all 351 towns and cities. At least there has to be an animal control officer covering each one. And also we have special state police officers under the MSPCA and the Animal Rescue League of Boston. And so those are organizations whose mission, whose mandate is animal welfare and animal protection. And so that overlap in having the MSPCA not only have animal sheltering, but animal hospital, also law enforcement, also a lobbying arm department, a legislative department, makes all the difference in the State House.
I had a question related to the new provision in one of the Mexican states that criminalizes failing to stun the animals before they're being slaughtered. My question is, has there also been a debate in that respect, either on the political side or when working with people on the ground, about corporate criminal liability? I'm kind of concerned about pressures being put on workers in terms of very often they fail to stun, not because that's what they want to do or because they have kind of the mindset to do that, but because of pressure from the slaughter line and pressure to keep up with the speed.
Yeah. Enforcement is definitely always part of the conversation. The Jalisco legislation, Mexico's slaughterhouse industry is a little bit unique in that there's 2 types of slaughterhouses. There's the federal rastros and then there's the municipal rastros. The municipal rastros, and both have problems with oversight and, with the agricultural agencies having the funding and the bandwidth to oversee the compliance with the good commercial practices or the actual now legal requirements. As far as the corporate actors themselves being liable, it's certainly part of the conversation. It's a little bit difficult at the state level because a lot of these places don't actually have employees. So the owners of the animals themselves will come in and slaughter the animals themselves. So there's not as much of a opportunity to prove the managerial oversight or the corporate oversight like there is in the U.S. With these issues. But yeah, it's definitely always part of the conversation and something that animal equality is very much prefers to go after the industrial or the broader problems with the farm animal cruelty and at slaughter. The cruelty, the vast majority of cruelty, of course, is the result of these institutional problems with line speeds and working conditions. And so we think it's a very holistic, we try and take a holistic approach to it, but sometimes you're restricted by the actual operations or the law. So.
I think we got time for one more question. Do we have anyone for any questions? Over here? Okay, we can squeeze in two. Please wait for the microphone. So he'll go first.
Hi. So apparently a lot of these ballots do very well, like well more than needed to pass once they make it to ballot. So have there been any recent ballots that have failed? If so, why? Like actually after the public votes on them?
Well, you said...
Let's just take both questions and we'll let you answer them both.
Okay.
Okay, so I was wondering why wouldn't it be better to like target certain states that have like greater amounts of factory farming and just more problems generally in the center of the United States where there's a lot more factory farming? Wouldn't it make more sense to target laws for those states?
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll start, but chime in, guys. I'll start with the second question first. So we, HSUS and other animal groups do work all across the country on trying to address these animal welfare issues. One of the things that was really impactful about Massachusetts ballot campaign is that it not only impacts the conditions that animals are raised in Massachusetts, but it also impacts the sales of products that come from animals raised in those conditions, regardless of where they were raised. So Massachusetts has a big market, and we source locally and beyond. So it has a really far-reaching impact. And then your question was about ballots failing, and but I couldn't quite tell if you meant things that were overturned after they passed or things that just failed on election day. And certainly both things happen, and there are recent campaigns that have failed, not on farm animal issues, but the 2014 ballot initiative for bears was unsuccessful. It was a narrow loss, and a large part of that loss was that the state of Maine actually had their game wardens go on television and tell people to vote no, which in many states would not be legal. However, in Maine, it is. So there are a number of reasons why a ballot initiative might fail on election day. Certainly, the no vote is easier. It is easier to convince a voter to vote no than to vote yes, because a yes vote is changing a law. A no is maintaining the status quo. So all you have to do is confuse somebody about what the yes vote would do, or put a little bit of doubt in their mind and they will vote no. So the yes is always harder than the no. So campaigns do fail on election day, and they can be overturned in some states. Some states there's a grace period where a legislature can't overturn a ballot initiative for a period of time. In Massachusetts, we don't have such a grace period. So in theory, the legislature could have, the day after our election day, overturned our ballot initiative. But especially when you win overwhelmingly, the legislature realizes that this is something constituents really want, and they are less likely to do that.
And it's something too, for example, Stephanie mentioned the ballot question about trapping here in Massachusetts, and there are bills filed every single legislative session to either amend or completely wipe that law off the books. But every time it comes up, when I was at the MSPC, we remind legislators about how overwhelmingly it passed at the ballot and how well it did in their district. And so you can just remind them of that. And if they take that vote, they're voting against the people that are, they represent. And so that's a tough vote for them to take often.
And with California's Question 12 that just passed in November, California is itself a very large ag-producing state, but it's also a huge market. So any producer in those middle states like Iowa or Missouri, anywhere that wants to sell eggs or pork into California, it has to be raised cage-free, so it has this extraterritorial effect. So, and sort of like they did with the fuel standards as well. But anyway, we've got to clear the room pretty quickly, so please join me again in thanking our guests.